I'm Rachel Tepper-Paley, Digital Managing Editor at Wine Enthusiast magazine. Today, we're chatting with Tyler Balliet, the author of a new norm-breaking wine book, Rebel School of Wine, a visual guide to drinking with confidence. Tyler is also the co-founder of Rosé Mansion, an immersive rosé-themed pop-up wine experience in New York City, and Wine Riot, a traveling wine tasting event that toured across the country from 2009 to 2016. All of Tyler's ventures have one thing in common. They seek to demystify wine and completely banish pretension, with the goal of bringing more people into the wine-drinking fold. We wanted to learn more about what motivates Balliet and how his image-forward new book is so different from most other wine books on the market. Thanks so much for being here, Tyler.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Tell us a little bit about why you chose to write this book.
So I decided to write my book, Rebel School of Wine, because at the end of the day, this is the book that I wish I had when I started out in wine. I've been in the industry for almost 20 years now, and there were so many questions I still had. And I wanted to kind of piece everything together and connect all of the dots, because I feel like when you get into the wine industry, you're just kind of shoved into it, and people are just start talking to you about all this in-depth information. You're like, what are you talking about? And so I wanted to kind of just draw a straight line from why do we do this? Why does wine exist? How did it come to be? Who makes it? Why do they make it? Why do they still make it? Who buys it? And all of those questions. That's kind of what I really wanted to tackle. But I also wanted to make a book where it had every single region. It had maps of every region, explained every single grape, how to buy, how to drink. So I kind of just crammed as much information as I possibly could in the 304 pages my publisher allowed me to write.
How do you think it factors into a lot of the current doom and gloom we're hearing about the state of the wine industry? Do you see this as a response to that? Is it are you coming to save the wine industry? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so the current doom and gloom in the wine industry is basically it's mostly U.S. wineries saying, oh my God, young people. And by young people, I mean millennials, which are 40 and under. So people under 40 aren't buying as much wine. And what I have to say to that is that that's been what I've been doing for 20 years. I focused on hey, let's sell wine to millennials, and I started that back in 2006, 2007. And that's been what I've been trying to do. And I've been trying to tell the wine industry, look, you have to talk to people differently. This language that you've come up with might have worked really well in the 70s and the 80s when you weren't selling that much wine. But if you want wine to become a consumer product, if you want wine to go mainstream and to be in every single, bar, every single restaurant, every single convenience store, every single grocery store, you can't just keep yelling technical jargon at people. And I've been saying that for 15 years, which is also why I wrote the outline for this book almost 15 years ago. So nothing's changed. But yeah, I think it's a direct, not reaction to now, but it's a reaction of what I saw over 15 years ago when I got into the industry. I was just you guys are doing this wrong. You're never going to connect with consumers this way.
And you mentioned before to me that you found that a lot of people, they didn't want to connect. They maybe said that they did, but their actions suggested otherwise. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, I ran this company called Wine Riot for, from 2009 until 2016. And it was this large scale wine festival. We would sell, between, 25,000 tickets a year. We would do it in 6 cities. You could come, you could try 250 or 300 different wines from all over the world. It was really, really fun. And it was meant to be educational. We marketed it and sold it as an educational event. And it's not anybody's fault necessarily, but we would sell booths to the wineries for dirt cheap, right? It would basically cover the cost of renting the tables and buying ice and stuff. And they didn't want to come on the weekends and talk to, the future generations. They didn't want to come and talk to millennials. And I get it. A lot of people were sales reps. They didn't get Monday off. They had to work really hard. It was a lot of hours. It was a lot of talking. It was a lot of explaining. But at the same time, if you look at the sales, if you look at wine sales over the last 20 years, they've gone up every single year. And that's not because the wine industry did a great job marketing, right? That's just because the sales went up. There's a great analogy. If you look at the computer industry back in like the 1990s, you can find a Best Buy flyer selling computers from 1996, right? It's like, it's got a 486 processor with a 28 baud modem, and you want this. And people had no idea what that meant, but they knew they needed a computer. They knew that this was the future and that this is what they wanted. And so even though the marketing was totally bad and terrible, computer sales went up. So it wasn't because the marketing was good that the sales went up. It's because the culture was changing, right? And then Steve Jobs showed up and was basically like, here's an iMac. Like, you can watch movies and call your friends. And that kind of language really started resonating. And that's when people really started caring what type of computer they were buying. And you're seeing the same thing in the wine industry, right? So for 20 years, wine sales went up. So if a wine company did zero marketing, they could pretty much guarantee that next year their sales would go up, right? But that's not because they were doing a good job connecting to this audience. It was because of change and shifting culture, you know? And we hit the high water mark. And so now, I don't know, like, you spent 20 years not marketing to an entire generation, and then you just kind of hope that they show up now. So yeah, I don't know. That's my view. And that's kind of like where I came in, because like I tried working with all these wineries and it was just a struggle. Like, nobody really had the resources. They had the resources. They just didn't choose to allocate them to marketing.
That's interesting. Like, you know, people right now are saying, oh my goodness, Gen Z doesn't drink wine. They're ruining it for everybody. But your perspective is like, you weren't marketing to millennials.
Oh yeah. It's been really interesting. And this is just mostly anecdotal, but I've seen in the last 5 years, like, millennials went from being very curious and very open to like wanting to learn about wine to just getting so frustrated. They're like, I don't care. I'm going to buy when I buy. And I'm tuning out everything else. I'm done trying to learn. I'm done trying to be educated. I'm done trying to do this on my own. Nobody came to them and said, hey, let's make your life better. Let me make your life easier. Instead, everybody was just trying to make their life harder. Like, well, you have to buy books and learn. And, you know, like, yeah, I did write a book about wine, but like that's, you know, you shouldn't have to buy a book and read the whole thing to be able to buy the product. It's like, okay, I've lived all over the country. When I lived in California, I always had a garden and I always grew tomatoes, you know, and I grew a lot of tomatoes. There was one point where I had like 50 tomato plants in my apartment in LA. And I make tomato sauce every single year. I go up to a farm and I buy tomatoes. Like, I love tomatoes. I don't actually know anything about tomatoes. I can name like 2 varieties, right? Like what, like Roma, plum, beefsteak, I guess. I don't know. I am probably in the top 1% of knowledgeable people on tomatoes, and I basically know nothing. I don't have to know anything to be completely obsessed with tomatoes, you know?
Right.
And I feel like
them.
That's what wine needs to be. That's how it is in France. You know, like, that's what really got me turned on, is like, I moved to France when I was like 22, 23. And I kind of realized that like the French, and this is my book too, but the French treat wine like we treat sports, you know? Like, I'm not a sports ball person, right? Like, I don't know. But like, I went to a Yankees game a couple weeks ago. I go to like one game a year. It's really fun to go, right? But I generally know the rules. I know what a home run is. I know when somebody gets on base, that's good. I know when you get like a strikeout is bad, right? I generally know what's going on. And that's how French people understand wine. They're not experts. They don't know more than we do. They just have a basic understanding to navigate them, and that makes them comfortable, you know? And at some point we made it wildly complicated.
Yeah. I think that's really true. I think that it really turns people off wine, to your point. And I mean, I think part of like what's so cool about your book is that it feels very fun. Like, it doesn't feel like a chore to read. And it's so visual, which it feels, I mean, it's literally on the front page, a visual guide to drinking with confidence. Can you tell me a little bit about that? That's clearly a purposeful thing for you.
Yeah. So again, like, this idea of like, learn what you want. Like, I am a very curious individual, right? Like, I love learning things when I want to. And I wanted to make a book that allowed you to do that, right? I also have like pretty extreme ADHD, you know, like my high school report card is very reflective of that. And so does my partner Morgan, who's like, she was the art director and she put together all the illustrations with her amazing illustrator Amber Day. And the goal was to make a book that you could just flip through, right? Like you could open to any page and just start reading. We kind of like were inspired by magazines, like you could just kind of flip through and find something. So you don't have to read it cover to cover. And there's 450 illustrations. And it was really interesting because like I've never written a book before. So I learned a lot about book publishing. And so like how most books do it is like you write a manuscript, you hand in the manuscript, and then your publisher and you figure out what illustrations or images would go well with it. But that's not how we wrote this book. We created the illustrations, like we hand drew like crayon in fist sketches. And then we found all these reference images. And then we worked with our illustrator over almost 3 years to put these illustrations together. And so the illustrations help explain, the sections in that book or what we're talking about. And there's 450 of them. We were inspired by children's books. We wanted to make a children's book for adults. The Way Things Work was like a book that I grew up reading, and I loved it so much because it explains how like everything from a paperclip to a nuclear reactor works with like visuals. And yeah, that's what we wanted to create for wine, like it's not dumbing anything down. Instead, it's like taking these complicated subjects and trying to make them easy to understand.
I think that that's so huge because even me, a person who works in wine every day, I constantly find myself in a situation where I will not know the answer to something. I will find a resource to tell me about these things. And like it drops you in assuming a lot of knowledge. It throws terms and complex things at you that, I'm a pretty knowledgeable person about this. And if I'm having trouble, I can only imagine what that feels like for somebody who is just digging into it. And what I love about your book is that, like you said, it doesn't dumb things down. It's not pedantic in that way.
Yeah, look, I wrote this book. I wrote it for smart people, right? Like I have a good friend. He has a PhD in biomedical engineering. It took like 2 years of friendship before he could even explain exactly what he did at his job. And, like he would look at wine and books and be like, why is this so hard to understand? And so what I really wanted to do was be like, it isn't hard to understand. It's just not being explained in the right way. And, the path that I've always taken was like, how do you ground it with something people know, And so like with regions, well, you can start with maps. Like we all went to like 3rd grade and learned that there's maps and countries. Like, that there's a country, that there's regions in that country. Cool. Let's start there and build on that. And the science aspects, like, cool, let's start with photosynthesis, which is interesting because like I bought every single wine book I could possibly find and not a single one mentions the word photosynthesis, which is like how plants create sugars, which is the basis for like, wine. And so I wanted to start there, like start with where we know. Let's start with like middle school chemistry class that we all suffered through. And then how do we build on that to get to something that makes sense,
Yeah. And you do it in a fun way. Like it's very colorful. There are all these fun stories throughout. Like I think that that's so key in bringing these things to life, like things that could be boring. It brings them very much to life. Did you like just find those in the course of research? Did you just know those things? Give us some good examples.
Yeah. So I did an incredible amount of research. Like I probably tripled my wine knowledge writing this book. And that wasn't the goal. Like I got this book deal like when the pandemic started and I was running Rosé Mansion. We had just hit 100 employees, like we ran a live event space where like 10,000 people a week would come through. Clearly that didn't do great in a pandemic. And so I got a book deal. And I was like, you know what? I can bang this thing out in like 8 or 9 months. And I started like, writing down all the stories that I knew about wine, which is like a lot of the stories you hear in like wine stores or like, they just didn't, when you say them out loud, you can like wave your hands and be like, and then this thing happened. But when you have to write it down, you have to like make sure that it's all factually accurate. And I was like, these just aren't adding up. And I started doing all this research, and reading more academic books. I started reading history books. And I was just like, this isn't, the stories that are being told, they're not wrong, but they're not correct. And what I wanted to do was like, just basically like do as much research as I possibly could and figure out how to write the story of like what actually happened with wine. But then there's a bunch of things that I wrote that I like. Enough time has passed that I kind of can't believe I wrote some of this stuff, you know? And people have been like, just random people that I've never met before have been like messaging me on Instagram, and they're like highlighting this one gentleman that his entire Instagram is just covered in bottles of expensive Burgundy. And he highlighted for me what I wrote about Pinot Noir. Yeah, in Burgundy, they say that Pinot Noir is simply a vehicle for communicating the characteristics of a specific vineyard site or terroir. Part of what keeps Pinot Noir lovers coming back for more is the wild inconsistencies among vineyards, vintages, and even specific bottles. It might take opening a dozen bottles of Burgundy before you find a truly exceptional one that makes you forget all the money you spent and question your own mortal existence. Skeptics might cite the behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner's work on unpredictable rewards, the same theory used by slot machines and casino games to create addictive behavior. And I don't know. I got some gems in there. Like, it was a pandemic. I was in like a room by myself for like 2 years writing this thing. And I tried to take all these facts that I knew. I tried to learn a lot more facts and then connect them in like a way that was like really funny and entertaining and kind of like all my observations. And so like there's some zingers. Like anybody that I've seen read the book, they'll just like start giggling and laughing here and there. And so that makes me really happy.
I was thoroughly entertained. What were some examples of like stories or like things that you wanted to have in the book that once you start researching them, they turned out to not be totally and completely true or fully like accurate?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things that so like left bank Bordeaux, right? You know, like right bank, left bank. Once you start looking into like the economics of the whole situation, right? You know, the right bank was always sold to the British, right? Going back like to Eleanor of Aquitaine, we're talking like 1080, you know, the 1080s, like way long time ago. It was sold as Claret. It went to like England. And then I read about how like, oh, the left bank was all swamp and it got drained. And I was like, and that was in the 1600s, I think 1640s. I was like, well, who drained the swamp? I was like, well, clearly the Dutch, right? Because like that's what they do. They like drain the sea. And so I was like, okay, well, why would they have drained the swamp in the 1640s? And what was going on in the 1640s? Well, it was the Dutch East India Company. So the Dutch East India Company was the very first corporation ever. It was also the most profitable corporation ever, right? Like in the 1640s, it had a value higher than I think like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple combined right now. And yeah, they're billionaires and they're rich and they don't want to drink the same stuff that the people in England are drinking. Like, look at any billionaires. They're like, I don't want to fly the same jet as the other billionaire. They're like, you know, then they went to the French and they were basically like, hey, let's like, you know, buy some wine. And the French were like, yeah. I mean, we can give you some of this. They're like, no, we're not going to drink what the English drink. Well, over there, all we got is swamp. They're like, well, I'll send my people. You know, and they just drain the swamp and they make a different style of wine because like billionaires can't drink the same thing that the other billionaires are drinking, you know?
Wow. So like in your, when you were first learning the story, like the story was just like, and then the swamp was drained and then like no deeper information, but the deeper information is the actual fascinating part of the story.
Yeah. And you have to like know that like, what was the Dutch East India Company? You know, like when was it started? When was it peaking? Who was running it? Why did it happen? And like, yeah. So, you know, there's a lot of things about war, you know, like you look at like Chile. Chile's an interesting, but I was always like, why are there only like 3 major wineries in Chile? Like, why does like 3 wineries produce like 90% of the wine, you know? And I started looking into it and I was like, oh, because back in like the 70s, they had like a democratically elected president that wanted to nationalize the copper mine. Nixon decided that he didn't like that. He sent the CIA in to overthrow the government and put in a dictator, Pinochet, who basically took over and just said, okay, there's only going to be 3 wineries who are my friends. And this isn't like conspiracy information. Like this information I read all about on CIA.gov. Like they have all the documents and they show you exactly what happened, you know? And they like, he was, you know, the dictator until the 90s. And so, you know, the politics side is really interesting. You know, like why, I really wanted to answer the question of like why France became like the gold standard, you know, because it is the best wine region in the world. They make the best wine in the world. They make more of it than anybody else, but there has to be a reason why. And I don't know, I just kind of came up with a lot of these questions and like my partner Morgan kept on just being like, but seriously, like you can't just spend a month researching to write a paragraph. Like this isn't ever going to get done. Like another thing I wanted to find was like, at what point did we start wine tasting as tourists, right? What was the very first wine tasting room in California? Because California invented the idea of wine tasting. You know, nobody had ever done that before. Like
I didn't
go
know
to
that.
a winery and buy a tasting. Like that was invented in California. So I wanted to go back and be like, what was the very first one? Who did it? And I started messaging like my friends in California, and they started pointing me to like the Sonoma County Historical Society. And I started doing all this research and digging into it. I couldn't find the exact one, but I basically found like the first one. It was like the Italian Swiss Colony Winery. It's an Asti. I actually drove by it. It's owned by Gallo now and it's abandoned. And I like the security guard tried to shoot me out last year when I tried to like drive around it. But they used to dress in lederhosen. And in the 1950s, people would drive up from San Francisco, from all over California, right? California wasn't that populated in the 50s. And they would drive there and they would put on this whole show. They would roll out barrels and it became this like whole like festival. And it went on all year long. And they invented this idea of like you go to the winery to try the wines, taste the wines, you know, and I recreated one of the images. They had postcards. I found postcards from the Sonoma County Historical Society that like showed what it looked like back then and stuff.
Wow.
You know?
What I love about this book is that it really does connect wine to so many other things that people probably have an understanding of, and it connects all these dots. And I feel like it does what I think a lot of wine tries to do, which is to like make the point that wine is a lens through which to view the world. And this book gives you a lot of like really interesting ways that it does that. And also maybe gives you a lot of information with which to be the most annoying person at a dinner party. I'm speaking about myself. This is like something I would do. I'd be like, did you know about left bank versus right bank?
That's me now. I'm like real fun at parties.
I feel like that's a good litmus test, though, for interesting people who are interested in these things. At least that's the way I look at the world. I like also that you have a lot of hot takes in it. Like you're really you're a defender of Oaky Chard, and personally, I love a hot take. So tell me about that.
There's a bunch of hot takes in here. So like the oaky buttery Chardonnay. Look, there's oaky buttery Chardonnay is great, you know, especially for what it is. Like, and what really bugs me is you go to any like cool restaurant and they won't even have Chardonnay on their glass pour list, but they won't even have anything that even kind of fits that flavor profile because they're like, oh, we're better than that. And it's like, you're better than your customers. And so, you know, if you look at the stereotypical drinker of like oaky buttery Chardonnay, you're looking at like, you know, like a woman in their like 30s to, you know, 50s. And the fact that like restaurants refuse to give customers what they want, what it says in the book and what I wrote was basically like, that's not called hospitality, that's called sexism. And it sucks. Like, I'm not saying that you can't have cool, esoteric, nerdy wines, but I think the fact that like people aren't willing to give customers what they want. Sweet wine is the biggest of all, right? So I've been on a whole sweet wine thing for a long time, right? It comes down to genetics. You have a gene that gives you a certain sensitivity to bitter flavors. We can test for it. It's really easy to find. There is a crap ton of peer-reviewed research on this, right? And you are either sensitive or not sensitive. You're either very sensitive or not. Women are genetically predisposed to be far more sensitive to bitter flavors than men, to a point that they don't necessarily exactly know, but maybe 50, 60% of women in America cannot drink dry red wine. It tastes too strong. Whereas like the people who are least sensitive are like white men. And so when you have like white dudes making wine lists, they're gonna be like, yeah, this is great. But then, you know, like a woman tastes it, or it also like depending on where your DNA comes from, if you come from a hotter, warmer climate, so like Africa, like, you know, like Mexico, like Central America, parts of Asia, you're going to be extremely sensitive. They think it has something to do with like bitter things or more poisonous. And like Scandinavia, they don't grow anything anyways. So like you can't, be that sensitive. But anyways, try to find a wine list in America at like a great restaurant that has a good selection of sweet wines. You won't find it. There are good sweet wines on the dessert list. And like I do this now. Like I'll just go and try to order sweet wine at like a nice fancy, 1-star Michelin restaurant, whatever. And the way they look at you, it's just like, no wonder these customers are not coming here. And when they do, they're ordering cocktails instead of wine. It's just like, this has always bugged me about the wine industry. It's like they're shooing away their customers. They're telling their customers, what you like is wrong. Can you imagine if any other industry did that? They wouldn't be in business.
For sure. We've talked a little bit about this, but I want to go back to it, which is that you wrote this book because it was the book that you wished you had when you were first coming up. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Let's like maybe start with your background, like way back when. How'd you get into wine and like the kinds of things that you used, and how it informed this book today?
Yeah, so like I kind of like most people, I kind of fell into the wine industry. You either were born into it or like after college something went wrong and you were like stumbled into it, because nobody like comes to your high school and says you can work in the wine industry, which they should, but whatever. And so after college, I ended up living in France for a year, really randomly. I had a girlfriend. She got an English teaching assistant position. I didn't really know anything about wine, but I drank a lot of it. I was broke, but, got to try a lot of different wines. Anything under €5, what back in like 2003, 2004 was like most wines in France. I moved back to the US. I ended up in Boston randomly, a city I'd never lived in before. I didn't know anybody. And I started working at this wine store because it was like across the street from my apartment. And I had a day job in an office, but I worked at the wine store like 2 nights a week. And that's where I saw, the problem that I would end up dedicating my career to, which is like I was trying to learn about wine, but I was really struggling. And at the same time, I watched all these people my age. I was like 25, 26 at the time. And they were coming into the store and they had so many questions about wine. And there wasn't a great way to answer it. Like, yeah. You could read a 900-page book or take a $1,200 class. But there wasn't an easy way to just be like, here's what I like. Here's how to buy more of it. And so I quit my day job and I started writing about wine, which paid nothing, but I got flown all over the world. And so I literally made $0. But I judged a wine competition in Portugal as on behalf of America. I was like the American judge. I was like 27 years old. I'm like, I am not qualified for this, but I was. So I would go on these press trips and I would be going to Europe. Like I once flew to Europe I had $38 in my bank account and I didn't have a credit card. And they said it was all expenses paid. I'm like, if it isn't, I live here now. Like I cannot get home. And my tactic was like, I would go to these wine tastings with all of these super top level experts, these winemakers. Like the first wine tasting I ever really went to professionally was with Jean Trimbach, and it was like, 500 years of winemaking or something. And like, there's like 200 people in the room and he was like, okay, cool. We just tasted all these amazing wines. Any questions? Not a single question. And so like, I would just raise my hand and just ask the simplest, most basic questions that I wasn't afraid to answer because like I was this outsider, like I wasn't a sales rep. I wasn't trying to work my way up anywhere. I was just this like kid with the blog and an email list, And so like, I just started asking questions. I started asking simple, basic questions. I didn't worry about if anybody laughed at me, which they did, but then I would watch them all write down the responses. Like they didn't know the answer either, And when I went on these press trips, I would be like in France and it would always be like, oh, we can take the bus to the next stop or somebody can ride with the winemaker. I'm like, I'm going to ride with the winemaker. But instead of asking them questions about wine, I would be like, are you struggling to import this stuff? What are your problems with the business? And I just asked them business questions. I asked them economics questions. I asked them about politics. And having lived in France and in Europe in general, come on, ask somebody from France, Spain, or Italy about politics and you're going to get a story, And that's how I ended up finding out all this information. That's how I ended up finding out all of this stuff is like, and they would always say, okay, turn off any kind of recording equipment you have or whatever, and I'll tell you what's actually going on. And I would always be like, click. like what's up? And so I was able to write this book with a lot of that inside information. Like, what's the real story with Prosecco? Like the name change and like, the DOC or the DOCG and like how the Prosecco producers are fighting off the corporations to like hold on to their own. Like, these are conversations I had in like, in cars and cafes with people that were like, you can't say that I said this, but here's what's actually happening. And I've had hundreds of those, like over the years.
Why do you think so many of these people were afraid to talk on the record about what they really thought about these things?
Politics. You know how these things work, right? Like, if you don't know how these things work, it doesn't matter what country you're in, but there are these like government organizations, right? So like in the EU, usually what they would do is they would have like, let's say the region of Alto Adige or whatever, like the producers all have their tax money go to an organization, and then, like the Italian government might match it, and then the EU might match that, right? And so it's a lot of politics, and the people in charge of these organizations have to play politics. Otherwise, they lose their money, they lose their funding, they lose their livelihood, And so they can't just hate on the neighbors. They can't hate on a system. They can't publicly hate on the government because they might lose that money, But like, they'll tell me the story and I'll tell the story as if I just won't have their name to it. And so I never really got a chance to I didn't have a forum to do that until I wrote this book. And so it's not like, it's just infused in it. So like, that's like the background. That's why that's how I found out about all of these different, these things going on that really dictate why are these wines on the shelf? Why am I drinking a wine from Austria right now? Like, how is that even possible? And there's a good story behind every single one of them.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you don't necessarily think people need to read this from front to back.
Yeah. So if you're a front to back reader, by all means, you can do that. Like my editor, who was incredible, made sure that was possible. And she made sure that it would flow and you would read really, really well front to back. So that's one way you can read it. That's not how I read books, but you can read it that way. I wrote it so that you can buy a bottle of wine and you can look it up. You can look up the region, you can look up the grape. I made it so that you can just kind of browse and flip through and look for inspiration, I made it so that if you are traveling to a specific country, you can open it up. Like in the Spanish section, I have a page that just says like how to eat and drink like a Spaniard. In Spain, they go to the bar 5 times a day. Like, why do I live here? Like, this is, I've been to Spain a lot of times, but like I have a very good friend who's a Spanish wine importer. He's from Spain. He lives, Patrick Mata from Olé Imports. And I've been to Spain with him a couple times and he helped me write this. And it's just like, it's wild. Like, you just go to the bar 5 times a day and it's social and it's all this fun stuff. So I wanted to put things in there that was like, somebody from these regions could look at it and be like, how did you know that? Like, I have the rules to the Australian drinking game called like Goon of Fortune, which is you put boxed wine on a clothes drying windmill thing that's in every single person's backyard and you spin it and there's all these rules. So yeah, it's like, look, wine is fun. Wine is like romantic. Wine is all of these things that like you lose as soon as somebody comes up to you and just starts saying, this wine really smells like boysenberries and blackberries and cherries. It's like, you just killed all of the fun, all of the romance, all of the sexiness, all of the mystique. You just destroyed all of that. And, like, that's why I'm in it. That's why I like wine, because of all those things. Like, you can travel to the place, you can go there on a cold, miserable night in the winter. You can close your blinds, you can cook some pasta, you can open a bottle of wine from Tuscany. Also, the Italian government has digitized every single song ever recorded in Italy over 100 years, and it's for free on the internet. So you can go and just pick an era. I always like picking 1960s Italian pop music, and you put the music on and you serve pasta and you drink Italian wine, and it's like you're in Italy for like a couple hours. You can wine transports you to these places. It's this magical thing. But it shouldn't just be like technical jargon, you know?
Do. I think that's a great place to wrap up. It was so fun talking to you, and I love how this book and speaking with you really brings wine to life, and I think everyone can learn from that. Thanks so much.
Amazing. Thank you.
Getting into wine shouldn't be a hard thing, which is why books like Rebel School of Wine have clearly struck a chord. We want to know, do you find it difficult or intimidating to learn about wine? Email us at podcast@wineenthusiast.net, and we might share your feedback on the podcast. We love hearing from you and appreciate your support. Please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember to visit us at wineenthusiast.com, content and products that bring your love of wine to life.